and welcome to U.S. Government. We're going to be working on Unit 3, pages 3 through 6. We're going to be covering all the questions in that in those pages, but a couple of the questions I won't directly answer because based on the information, you should be able to answer them on your own. But you should be able to answer every single question. All right, let's go ahead and get going. Again, nothing to skip here. So, judicial activism versus judicial restraint. For the next couple of videos in class, we're going to be talking about the Supreme Court. So, the Supreme Court has the power to overturn laws, and they have the final say. There's only two ways that the Supreme Court's decisions can be overturned. One is by changing the Constitution itself, by passing an amendment. Because again, no one can tell them that their decisions are wrong except for themselves, which is the other way that a Supreme Court decision can be overturned, is if the Supreme Court itself changes its mind. That's it. Congress, people, voters, president, no one can tell them, no, we don't like that. What they say goes. That is, if they throw out a law, it's out unless you actually change the Constitution, because they're supposed to interpret the Constitution. But different courts have approached this in different ways. Those who believe in judicial activism take a more active role in using their judgments to almost create new law, or to create new rules by which people need to understand to make new laws. And then there's judicial restraint, where they try to not use their powers very often. They try to not interfere with government and interfere with decisions that Congress makes unless it's absolutely necessary. The Warren Court, which is the court that was in session, it's named after the lead judge, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, the kind of leader. They all have equal votes, but there's one guy who kind of organizes it all and decides who's going to write what arguments. His name is Warren, and for the longest time, he was the leader of the Supreme Court, and a lot of famous decisions were done under his jurisdiction, under his leadership. And they did a lot of activist type decisions. Not everything, but very activist. They really changed a lot about the way the law and constitutional law would be interpreted for the future, all the way till today. Then starting in the 80s and into the 2000s, it became the Rehnquist Court. Warren is no longer a member. Judge Rehnquist became the leader of the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice. And they were known for a very different kind of court, and they were trying to limit government power. They wanted to have much freedom for people and for businesses as possible. So, we have to go back before either of those two courts to get to our first court case back in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson. A man by the name of Homer Plessy sued a train company because he was a black man and he was forced to sit in a blacks only car on the train, and he wanted to be able to sit anywhere he wanted, including the whites only train. And he sued them, and he appealed and finally reached the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said that the train company is doing nothing wrong by segregating blacks from whites and forcing blacks to sit in another car as long as all the cars were equal. And that would apply to any laws in all the United States. You could choose to say blacks have to go over there and whites can go over there, as long as you proved that what you offered both colors was equal. The reality is if you separate people, it's inherently not going to be equal. People are just not going to be treated the same if you're separating them. People can only achieve equality and unity if they're together, if they're united. And you can't do that if you allow people to force separations. So almost 60 years later, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka took the case of school segregation to the Supreme Court, saying you can't have blacks only schools and whites only schools because they're not equal. You had little girls having to, like, little girls, I'm not talking like teenagers, like second graders, third graders having to walk miles to school because the white school was the nearby school and the black school was farther away. How is that equal? So that was the argument, that you cannot segregate people. And as a result, Brown versus Board of Education not only ended school segregation, but ended all segregation, all these whites only, blacks only laws all across the country. It wasn't quite as easy as that. There was a lot of violence and fighting and protests afterwards, and the military had to get involved to force segregation, because even though the law changed, a lot of Southerners were not going to allow it to happen. But the law did change. Finally, the Supreme Court in 1972, now this is under Warren, the Warren Court, they got the case of this guy named Furman. And Furman was given the death penalty, and he said that the death penalty he was given was not fair. That there's a lot of weak evidence in the trial, that there's some room for doubt whether he did it or not. Plus, he was making an argument that people that weren't black in similar situations, accused of similar crimes, were not getting the death penalty. And so this went all the way to the Supreme Court, and they decided, based on the Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishment inflicted. Meaning, if you're going to have a law and a punishment for one person, it has to be the same for all. You can't just decide, well, if this guy murdered someone, well, the blacks will put to death and the whites will put on death row. You can't do that. And they saw evidence that things like that were happening. So they said, the Supreme Court said, capital punishment, executions, death sentences should be carried out with consistency and equality, or not at all. Now, the problem with that decision is a lot of states were afraid to do the death penalty at all. Now, they thought the Supreme Court was saying you can't ever have capital punishment, or you're against the Constitution. So a few years later, a similar court case was brought all the way up to the Supreme Court, saying that this guy Greg, who was a murderer, should not be executed based on Furman versus Georgia. Well, in Gregg versus Georgia, the Supreme Court under Warren decided, well, actually, capital punishment is okay. You can give the death sentence if you want to, as long as you're being consistent with it. And they decided that Gregg here was not unfairly assigned the death sentence, and so he could be put to death. So they just confirmed it's okay to have capital punishment. You just can't decide when you're going to force it and when you're going to not. Roe versus Wade. This is the big deal. This is one of the big deal Supreme Court decisions that's still argued about today. And based on the Ninth Amendment, the Roe is arguing that abortions should be allowed. That states can't pass laws saying you can't have an abortion. And Supreme Court said no. The Ninth Amendment says that you can't pass laws that infringe on anybody's rights. And they decided that the right to choose is a right that can't be infringed based on the Ninth Amendment. Even though abortion rights aren't clearly laid out, the Ninth Amendment says any rights not clearly laid out, that doesn't mean that they can be violated. So it killed almost all state laws against abortion, and allowed government to say no to abortions only after the first 3 months. Later, if the state wanted to, but after the first 3 months, the government has the freedom to say no abortion, but not for the first 3 months. Well, another court case years later came up and said, like, well, okay, the government can't pass laws about abortion, or say you can't have an abortion, but does that mean we have to use government taxpayer money to support doctors who give abortions? And the Supreme Court decision in Webster versus Reproductive Health Services, no. The government can't say no to abortions in the first trimester, but that doesn't mean they have to support it. If people don't want taxpayer money, voice in government to be spent on abortions, then they don't have to. And the states can decide, we're not going to support abortions. We won't say you can't do it, but you don't get any government money. Health insurance doesn't have to help cover it. We're not going to force any taxpayer money to support abortions. And that's decided state by state as a result of Webster versus Reproductive Health Services. And that's it. Don't forget the Edmodo quiz. The textbook assignment we're going to be testing on in class is Unit 2, pages 25 to 30. You can do those. Just go to the packet and read the textbook. And I'll see you soon.